If I asked you to name a fat loss compound, you'd probably say Ozempic, maybe clenbuterol, maybe even something terrifying from a 1990s bodybuilding forum that was immediately banned by 3 different governments. But what if I told you that some of the most interesting fat loss compounds ever discovered aren't trying to make you eat less, they're not trying to increase your heart rate, and they're not even really trying to burn fat. Instead, they're attempting to change the way your body uses energy itself, which sounds less like a weight loss strategy and more like something a supervillain would explain before destroying a major city. Today, we're talking about 2 compounds that most people have never heard of: MOTS-C and 5-amino-1-MQ. And despite being lumped together as fat loss compounds, these 2 molecules are trying to solve the problem of body fat in completely different ways. One attempts to improve how your cells produce and use energy. The other attempts to stop your body from being so good at storing energy in the first place. Which raises a fascinating question. Are these actually fat loss compounds, or are they something much stranger? Before we talk about these compounds, we need to address something that nobody likes admitting. Your body is actually incredibly good at its job. Unfortunately, its job is not making you look good shirtless. Your body's primary objective is survival. And for hundreds of thousands of years, body fat was one of humanity's greatest evolutionary advantages. Body fat means stored energy. Stored energy means survival. Survival means you get to pass on your genes. It's a beautiful system, unless you're trying to get abs, because then your body essentially turns into that friend who constantly tells you, "Are you sure you want to do that?" Every time you lose weight, your body responds by increasing hunger, reducing energy expenditure, making you think about food every 7 minutes, and convincing you that eating an entire pizza is somehow a rational survival decision. Which is why scientists eventually started asking a completely different question. Instead of, how do we burn more fat? What if we asked, how do we change the way the body handles energy altogether? And that's where things start getting weird. Let's start with MOTS-C, and honestly, the first weird thing about MOTS-C is where it comes from. Because for decades, scientists believed that mitochondria had one job: produce energy. That's it. They're basically the power plants of the cell. Then researchers discovered something bizarre. Your mitochondria don't just produce energy, they also produce signaling molecules, which is a little bit like discovering that your car engine has been secretly running your household finances. One of these molecules is called MOTS-C, and scientists became interested in it because early research suggested it may influence things like insulin sensitivity, glucose metabolism, energy utilization, and potentially even some adaptations associated with exercise. Which led to a very interesting question. What if we could make the body behave as though it had become metabolically healthier? Not by forcing it, but by changing the underlying systems that regulate energy use. Think about traditional fat loss. The approach is basically, eat less, move more, try not to cry. MOTS-C asks a completely different question. What if we upgraded the engine itself? Because if your body becomes more efficient at handling energy, then theoretically everything downstream changes too. And honestly, that idea is either incredibly exciting or deeply offensive to anyone who's ever spent 2 hours on a Stairmaster. Probably both. Now let's talk about 5-amino-1-MQ. Because if MOTS-C tries to improve the engine, 5-amino-1-MQ tries to release the parking brake. To understand why, we need to talk about an enzyme called NNMT, which until a few years ago, almost nobody outside of metabolism research had ever heard of. Then scientists started noticing something strange. People with obesity often appeared to have elevated NMT activity, which raised a fascinating question. What if part of the reason some bodies are so efficient at storing energy is because they're literally optimized to do so? And if that's true, what happens if you interfere with that process? That's where 5-amino-1-MQ enters the picture. 5-amino-1-MQ acts as an inhibitor of NMT. Now, without turning this video into a biochemistry lecture that causes everyone to click off immediately, the simplified explanation is this. Scientists believe that reducing NMT activity may influence how the body stores and utilizes energy. In other words, instead of trying to force more calories out, what if we simply made the body less efficient at keeping them? Think of your metabolism like a car. Most fat loss compounds slam harder on the accelerator. 5-amino-1-MQ asks, what happens if we release the handbrake instead? Which honestly sounds exactly like something bodybuilders would do. Here's what makes these compounds so fascinating. Neither one really behaves like a traditional fat burner. Let's compare them. MOTS-C asks, can we improve the way cells create and use energy? 5-amino-1-MQ asks, can we alter the systems that determine how energy gets stored? One targets metabolic performance. The other targets metabolic efficiency. One upgrades the engine. The other removes restrictions on the engine. And perhaps the strangest part of all of this is that neither approach sounds anything like traditional dieting. Nobody is counting calories. Nobody is eating boiled chicken. Nobody is pretending to enjoy cardio. Instead, we're talking about reprogramming metabolism itself, which sounds less like fitness advice and more like something you'd hear at a biotechnology conference attended exclusively by bodybuilders. So, are MEP-C and 5-amino-1-MQ the future of fat loss? Honestly, maybe. But perhaps that's not the most interesting question, because what's truly fascinating about these compounds isn't necessarily how much fat they help you lose, it's how they force us to think about fat loss differently. For decades, we've treated fat loss like a math problem. Eat less, move more, end of discussion. But what if fat loss is actually an engineering problem? What if the future of getting lean isn't simply about suffering harder? What if it's about understanding the biological systems responsible for energy production, storage, and metabolism itself? Because once you start looking at compounds like MOTSC and 5-amino-1-MQ, you realize something strange. They're not really trying to burn fat. They're trying to change the operating system that decides what happens to your calories in the first place. And honestly, that might be the most interesting fat loss idea nobody's talking about.